You think housing is expensive now? Try building homes for 300 million people with a budget that wouldn't cover a suburb today. The Soviet Union pulled off the largest, cheapest mass housing construction program in human history, sheltering millions of families in buildings that cost almost nothing per unit. And here's the wild part. Those buildings are still standing 70 years later, still housing people, still functioning despite being built as quickly and cheaply as physically possible. The story of how the Soviets housed entire nations on a shoestring budget will make you question everything you know about construction costs, housing policy, and what humans actually need to survive. Let's start with the problem the Soviets faced after World War II. 27 million dead, 25 million homeless. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Stalin's industrialization had already created massive urban migration, cramming rural peasants into cities faster than housing could be built. Then, the war destroyed whatever housing existed. By 1945, the USSR faced the most severe housing crisis in human history. Something had to be done, and it had to be done fast and cheap. Really, really cheap. The solution came from Nikita Khrushchev, who took power after Stalin died in 1953. Khrushchev looked at the housing situation and made a brutally practical decision. Forget quality. Forget aesthetics. Forget anything that wasn't absolutely essential. Build the minimum viable housing that would keep people alive and do it as fast and cheap as possible. This wasn't a housing program. It was an industrial manufacturing process applied to human shelter. And it worked in ways that are kind of impressive and kind of horrifying at the same time. The key innovation was standardization, taken to an extreme that would make Henry Ford jealous. Soviet engineers designed a small number of standard apartment building types that could be built identically in every city across 11 time zones. These weren't custom projects adapted to local conditions. These were literally identical buildings mass-produced like widgets in a factory. The most common design, called the Khrushchyovka, became the default housing for the entire Soviet Union. 5 stories tall, 4 apartments per floor. 20 units total. Exact same design in Moscow, Vladivostok, and everywhere in between. Why 5 stories? Because Soviet building codes didn't require elevators in buildings under 6 stories. Elevators cost money. Elevators break down. Elevators require maintenance. So they built everything 5 stories tall and saved a fortune by making residents use stairs. This single decision saved billions of rubles across millions of buildings. Was it convenient for elderly people carrying groceries? Absolutely not. Did it make the buildings significantly cheaper? You bet it did. The construction method was pure genius from a cost perspective. Instead of traditional brick-by-brick construction, Soviet engineers developed prefabricated concrete panel systems. Massive concrete slabs were cast in factories, transported to building sites, and assembled like giant Lego blocks. Walls, floors, ceilings, everything came pre-made. Construction crews just bolted the pieces together and moved on to the next building. This prefab method meant a Khrushchyovka could be built in 12 months from start to finish. Sometimes faster if the construction brigade was motivated or desperate to meet quotas. The concrete panels themselves were made as cheaply as possible. Minimal reinforcement. Just enough structural integrity to meet safety standards and not one bit more. The concrete mix used more filler and less cement than Western standards would allow. Quality control was whatever the local factory manager felt like enforcing that week. Some panels were fine, others had air pockets, improper curing, or inconsistent composition. But they were cheap. And, mostly, they didn't collapse. So good enough. Let's talk about apartment size, because this is where the cheapness really shows. A standard Khrushchyovka apartment for a family ranged from 30 to 60 square meters. That's roughly 300 to 650 square feet for an entire family. American readers, imagine fitting your whole family into a space smaller than a two-car garage. Soviet planners calculated the minimum space humans needed to exist and designed accordingly. Bedrooms barely fit a bed. Kitchens were so small you couldn't open the refrigerator door fully if someone was standing at the stove. But again, the goal wasn't comfort. The goal was shelter at minimum cost. The ceilings were low, like really low, around 2.5 meters, or just over 8 feet. This saved materials on walls and reduced heating costs. Tall people constantly bumped their heads on door frames. But shorter ceilings meant less volume to heat during brutal Russian winters. And that mattered more than comfort. Every design decision came back to the same calculation. What's the absolute minimum we can provide while still having something technically qualify as housing? Interior finishes were basically non-existent. Concrete walls got a thin coat of plaster and paint. That's it. Floors were bare concrete, or the cheapest possible wood parquet. No baseboards, no crown molding, no architectural details whatsoever. The aesthetic was industrial warehouse meets prison cell. And that was fine because aesthetics cost money. Windows were small and poorly insulated because glass was expensive. Doors were hollow and flimsy because solid doors cost more. Everything was the cheapest possible option that technically functioned. The plumbing situation deserves its own discussion. Soviet apartments had running water and indoor plumbing, which was actually a huge improvement over what most people had before. But the pipes were undersized, poorly installed, and made from whatever materials were available, usually thin steel that rusted quickly. Leaks were constant. Water pressure was terrible, especially on upper floors. Hot water came from centralized district heating systems that broke down constantly. But again, indoor plumbing of any quality beat hauling water from a well, so residents dealt with it. Bathrooms were tiny, and I mean truly tiny. The toilet, sink, and bathtub were crammed into a space the size of a closet. You could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink simultaneously. The bathtub was so short, you had to choose between submerging your torso or your legs, but never both at once. Soviet designers looked at bathroom fixtures and asked, "What's the minimum functional size?" Then built to that exact specification. Kitchens were marginally better, but still absurdly small. The standard kitchen in a Khrushchyovka was about 6 square meters, roughly 65 square feet. That included space for a small refrigerator, a 2-burner stove, a sink, and maybe one section of counter space. Storage was minimal. The idea that you might want to cook elaborate meals or have multiple people in the kitchen simultaneously never entered the planning process. Kitchens were for basic food preparation, nothing more. But here's where Soviet cheapness created an unexpected feature. The kitchen became the social center of apartment life. Because kitchens were separate rooms with doors, they offered the only real privacy in cramped apartments. Families gathered around tiny kitchen tables for meals, conversations, and tea that lasted hours. Friends squeezed into impossibly small kitchens for gatherings that Soviet living rooms were too public for. The enforced intimacy of tiny kitchens created a whole social culture around kitchen table conversations that became central to Soviet life. The heating system was another cost-saving masterpiece. Individual apartment heating would have been expensive. Boilers, thermostats, individual controls, too much money. So the Soviets built massive district heating plants that served entire neighborhoods through underground pipes. Your apartment had radiators connected to this central system, and that was it. No thermostat, no control. Heat came on in October and turned off in April regardless of actual weather. Too hot? Open a window. Too cold? Wear more layers. But from a cost perspective, district heating was brilliant. One plant heated thousands of apartments with minimal per-unit cost. Sound insulation was basically a joke. The thin concrete panels between apartments blocked almost nothing. You heard your neighbors' conversations, their arguments, their televisions, their intimate moments. Privacy was a luxury Soviet construction couldn't afford. Some buildings were so poorly insulated for sound that residents could follow entire conversations through walls. This created a culture where everyone knew everyone else's business, because you literally couldn't avoid hearing it. The lack of privacy wasn't a bug. It was an accepted feature of cheap construction. The exterior appearance of these buildings was pure function over form. Concrete panels, straight lines, zero ornamentation, identical repetitive facades stretching for blocks. Soviet architects weren't trying to create beautiful buildings. They were trying to create weather-tight boxes for humans at minimum cost. The aesthetic of Soviet housing became one of the most recognizable architectural styles in the world. Brutalist, repetitive, gray, and deeply depressing to look at. But let's give credit where it's due. These buildings worked. Millions of families moved from communal apartments, barracks, and hovels into their own self-contained units, with private kitchens and bathrooms. The improvement in quality of life was real and significant. Yes, the apartments were tiny and poorly built, but they were yours. You had a door you could lock. You could cook without sharing a kitchen with 5 other families. You could use a bathroom without queuing. For people who'd lived in far worse conditions, Khrushchyovkas were actually a meaningful upgrade. The construction pace was absolutely staggering. At the program's peak in the 1960s, the Soviet Union was completing 2 million apartments per year. That's nearly 5,500 apartments, finished every single day. Entire neighborhoods appeared from empty fields in months. Cities doubled in size in a few years. The scale of construction was unprecedented in human history and hasn't been matched since. And all of it was done using the cheapest methods and materials possible. The cost per unit was ridiculously low by any standard. Exact figures are hard to calculate because Soviet accounting was bizarre and didn't translate well to market economics. But estimates suggest a Khrushchyovka apartment cost between 3,000 and 5,000 rubles to build at a time when average monthly wages were around 100 rubles. By comparison, housing in the West cost anywhere from 5 to 10 times more per square meter. The Soviets achieved this through brutal standardization, minimal quality, prefabrication, and eliminating anything not absolutely essential. Labor costs were kept low through a combination of factors. Construction workers were paid poorly. Much of the labor came from mandatory work assignments for students and volunteers who weren't exactly volunteering. Prisoners provided some construction labor, and the work itself required minimal skill because everything was prefabricated. Crane operators assembled pre-made panels. That was basically it. You didn't need master craftsmen to bolt together concrete slabs. Materials costs stayed low because the Soviet Union had vast natural resources and state-owned industries. Concrete came from state quarries. Steel came from state foundries. Transport was handled by state railways. There was no profit markup at any stage because profit wasn't the goal. The entire supply chain operated at cost, and sometimes below cost, if meeting quotas was more important than financial sustainability. This allowed construction at prices that would have been impossible in market economies. The long-term costs of this cheap construction are significant, but weren't considered during the building frenzy. Khrushchyovkas were designed with a lifespan of 25 years. They were meant to be temporary housing until something better could be built. Except something better never came for most people. And 70 years later, millions still live in buildings that were supposed to be demolished decades ago. The maintenance burden is enormous. The energy efficiency is terrible by modern standards, but they're still standing and still providing shelter, which is kind of remarkable given how cheaply they were built. Modern developers look at Soviet housing construction with a mix of horror and envy. Horror at the quality, the aesthetics, the living conditions. Envy at the costs and construction speed. Building a housing project today involves environmental reviews, community input, architectural competitions, building codes, union labor, and endless regulations. All of those things make housing safer, more pleasant, and more expensive. The Soviets just built concrete boxes and moved people in before the paint dried. There's a dark lesson in Soviet housing about what's actually possible when you remove all constraints except basic functionality. Turns out, you can house enormous populations very cheaply if you're willing to sacrifice comfort, privacy, aesthetics, and quality. The Soviets proved that the minimum viable housing humans need to survive is shockingly cheap to build. The question is whether that minimum is acceptable by any standard beyond pure survival. The social impact of cheap mass housing was enormous. Moving from communal apartments to private units, even tiny ones, gave families unprecedented privacy and autonomy. Birth rates increased. Divorce rates increased too, because couples no longer had to stay together due to housing scarcity. The ability to lock your door and have space that was yours, even if that space was a 400-square-foot concrete box, fundamentally changed how people lived. But the sameness of Soviet housing also created psychological effects that planners never considered. Living in identical buildings in identical neighborhoods created a sense of placelessness. Your apartment looked like everyone else's apartment. Your building looked like every other building. Neighborhoods lacked identity or character. This architectural monotony contributed to a general sense of dreariness that defined Soviet urban life. When everything looks the same and nothing looks good, your environment becomes depressing in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. The Khrushchyovka program officially ended in the 1970s when the Soviet Union started building slightly better apartment blocks with elevators and marginally more space. But the legacy remained. Millions of these buildings still stand today across the former Soviet Union. Some have been renovated and improved. Others are literally falling apart, sheltering people in conditions that barely meet modern habitability standards. They're a permanent reminder of what happens when you prioritize quantity over quality and build for the absolute minimum cost. Here's what's truly fascinating. Despite all the problems, many people who grew up in Khrushchyovkas have genuine nostalgia for them. Not because the buildings were good, but because the life that happened inside them was meaningful. The neighbors you knew. The courtyard where kids played. The shared experience of making a tiny apartment feel like home. Human beings are remarkably good at creating warmth and meaning even in the most architecturally depressing spaces imaginable. The Soviet housing experiment proved several things about large-scale construction. First, standardization dramatically reduces costs. Second, prefabrication enables speed impossible with traditional methods. Third, eliminating aesthetic considerations and luxury features cuts expenses enormously. Fourth, state control of the entire supply chain removes profit margins and transaction costs. And fifth, you can build functional shelter very cheaply if you're willing to accept minimal quality and comfort. Modern housing crises in expensive cities make people look back at Soviet solutions with morbid curiosity. Could we build that cheaply today? Technically, yes. Practically, no. Because our building codes, labor laws, environmental regulations, and cultural expectations are completely different. We've collectively decided that housing should meet standards far beyond the Soviet minimum. Whether that's good or bad depends on whether you're homeless and desperate for any shelter, or whether you're living in a 400-square-foot concrete box with paper-thin walls. The Soviets built the cheapest housing in history by asking one simple question: what's the absolute minimum humans need to survive? Then they built exactly that, and nothing more. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't something anyone would choose if better options existed. But it sheltered hundreds of millions of people who otherwise would have had nothing. And 70 years later, those concrete boxes are still standing, still housing people, still functioning despite being built as quickly and cheaply as physically possible. That's either inspiring or terrifying depending on your perspective, and honestly, it's probably both.